Two utterly different characters were to be inspired by it. Both would bring improvements to the wireless telegraph, and both will be remembered for their contribution to science far more than Oliver Lodge. The first was Guglielmo Marconi.
Marconi was a very intelligent, astute, and a very charming individual. He definitely had the Italian-Irish charm. He could apply this to almost anyone, from sort of young ladies to world-renowned scientists.
Marconi was no scientist, but he read all he could of other people's work in order to put together his own wireless telegraph system.
And it's possible that because he was brought up in Bologna and it was fairly close to the Italian coast, that he saw the potential of wireless communications in relation to maritime usage fairly early on. Then,
aged only 22, he came to London with his Irish mother to market it. The other person inspired by Lodge's lecture was a teacher at the Presidency College in Calcutta called Jagadish Chandra Bose. Despite degrees from London and Cambridge, the appointment of an Indian as a scientist in Calcutta had been a battle against racial prejudice. Indians, it was said, didn't have the requisite temperament for exact science. Well, Bose was determined to prove this wrong, and here in the archives we can see just how fast he set to work. This is a report of the 66th meeting of the British Association in Liverpool, September 1896. And here is Bose, the first Indian ever to present at the association meeting, talking about his work and demonstrating his apparatus. He'd built and improved on the detector that Lodge described, because in the hot, sticky Indian climate, he'd found that the metal filings inside the tube that Lodge used to detect the waves became rusty and stuck together. So Bose had to build a more practical detector using a coiled wire instead. His work was described as a sensation. The detector was extremely reliable and could work on board ships, so had great potential for the vast British naval fleet.
Britain was the centre of a vast telecommunications network which stretched almost around the world, which was used to support an equally vast maritime network of merchant and naval vessels which were used to support the British Empire.
But Bose, a pure scientist, wasn't interested in the commercial potential of wireless signals, unlike Marconi.
This was a sort of a new cutting-edge field, but Marconi wasn't a trained scientist, so he did come at things in a fairly different way, which may have been why he progressed so quickly in the first place. And he was very good at forming connections with the people that he needed to form connections with to enable his work to be done.
Marconi used his connections to go straight to the only place that had the resources to help him. The British Post Office was a hugely powerful institution. When Marconi first arrived in London in 1896, these buildings were newly completed and already heaving with business from the Empire's postal and telegraphy services. Marconi had brought his telegraph system with him from Italy, claiming it could send wireless signals over unheard-of distances. And the Post Office engineer-in-chief, William Preece, immediately saw the technology's potential. So Preece offered Marconi the great financial and engineering resources of the Post Office, and they started work up on the roof. The old headquarters of the Post Office were right there, and between this roof and that one, Marconi and the Post Office engineers would practice sending and receiving electromagnetic waves. The engineers helped him improve his apparatus, and then Preece and Marconi together demonstrated it to influential people in government and the Navy. What Preece didn't realise was that even as he was proudly announcing Marconi's successful partnership with the Post Office, Marconi was making plans behind the scenes. He'd applied for a British patent on the whole field of wireless telegraphy and was planning on setting up his own company. When the patent was granted, all hell broke loose in the scientific community. That patent was itself revolutionary. You see, patents could only be taken out on things that weren't public knowledge. But Marconi famously had hidden his equipment in a secret box. And here it is. When his patent was finally granted, Marconi ceremoniously opened the box. Everyone was keen to see what inventions lay within. Batteries forming a circuit, iron filings in the tube to complete the circuit to ring the bell on top. Nothing they hadn't seen before. And yet Marconi had patented the lot.
The reason why Marconi is famous is not because of that invention. He doesn't invent radio, right? But he improves it and turns it into a system. Lodge doesn't do that. And that's why we remember Marconi, and that's why we don't remember Lodge.
The scientific world was up in arms. Here was this young man who knew very little about the science behind his equipment, about to make his fortune from their work. Even his great supporter, Preece, was disappointed and hurt when he found out that Marconi was about to go it alone and set up his own company. Lodge and other scientists began a frenzy of patenting every tiny detail and improvement they made to their equipment. This new atmosphere shocked Bose when he returned to Britain. Bose wrote home to India in disgust at what he found in England. Money, 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 all the time. What a devouring greed. I wish you could see the craze for money of the people here. His disillusionment with the changes he saw in the country he revered for its scientific integrity and excellence is palpable. Eventually, though, it was his friends who convinced Bose to take out his one and only patent on his discovery of a new kind of detector for waves. It was this discovery that would lead to perhaps an even greater revolution for the world. He had discovered the power of crystals.
This replaces older techniques using iron filings, which are messy and difficult and don't work well. And here's a whole new way of detecting radio waves, and it's one that's going to be at the centre of a radio industry.
Bose's discovery was simple, but it would truly shape the modern world. When some crystals are touched with metal to test their electrical conductivity, they can show rather odd and varied behaviour. Take this crystal, for example. If I can touch it in exactly the right spot with the tip of this metal wire and then hook it up to a battery, it gives quite a significant current. But if I switch around my connections to the battery and try and pass the current through in the opposite direction, it's a lot less. It's not a full conductor of electricity. It's a semiconductor, and it found its first use in detecting electromagnetic waves. When Bose used a crystal like this in his circuits instead of the tube of filings, he found it was a much more efficient and effective detector of electromagnetic waves. It was this strange property of the junction between the wire, known as the cat's whisker, and the crystal, which allowed current to pass much more easily in one direction than the other, that meant it could be used to extract a signal from electromagnetic waves. At the time, no one had any idea why certain crystals acted in this way. But to scientists and engineers, the strange behavior had a profound and almost miraculous practical effect. With crystals as detectors, now it was possible to broadcast and detect the actual sound of a human voice or music. In his Oxford lecture in 1894, Oliver Lodge had opened a Pandora's box. As an academic, he'd failed to foresee that the scientific discoveries he'd been such a part of had such commercial potential. The one patent he had managed to secure, the crucial means of tuning a receiver to a particular radio signal, was bought off him by Marconi's powerful company. Perhaps the worst indignation for Lodge, though, would come in 1909, when Marconi was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics for wireless communication. It's difficult to imagine a bigger snub to the physicist who'd so narrowly missed out to Hertz in the discovery of radio waves, and who'd then go on to show the world how they could be sent and received. But despite this snub, Lodge remained magnanimous, using the new broadcasting technology that resulted from his work to give credit to others, as this rare film of him shows.
Hertz made a great advance. He discovered how to produce and detect waves in space, thus bringing the ether into practical use, harnessing it for the transmission of intelligence in a way which has subsequently been elaborated by a number of people.
Today, we can hardly imagine a world without broadcasting. To imagine a time when radio waves hadn't even been dreamt of. Engineers continued to refine and perfect our ability to transmit and receive electromagnetic waves. But their initial discovery was ultimately a triumph of pure science, from Maxwell through Hertz to Lodge. But still, the very nature of electricity itself remained unexplained. What created those electrical charges and currents in the first place? Although scientists were learning to exploit electricity, they still didn't know what it actually was. But this question was being answered, with experiments looking into how electricity flowed through different materials. Back in the 1850s, one of Germany's great experimentalists and a talented glassblower, Heinrich Geissler, created these beautiful showpieces. Geissler pumped most of the air out of these intricate glass tubes and then had small amounts of other gases pumped in. He then passed an electrical current through them. They glowed with stunning colours, and the current flowing through the gas seemed tangible. Although they were designed purely for entertainment, over the next 50 years, scientists saw Geissler's tubes as a chance to study how electricity flowed. Efforts were made to pump more and more air out of the tubes. Could the electric current pass through nothingness, through the vacuum? This is a very rare flickbook film of the British scientist who created a vacuum good enough to answer that question. His name was William Crookes. Crookes created tubes like this. He pumped out as much of the air as he could so that it was as close to a vacuum as he could make it. Then, when he passed an electric current through the tube, he noticed a bright glow on the far end. A beam seemed to be shining through the tube and hitting the glass at the other end. It seemed at last we could see electricity. the beam became known as a cathode ray, and this tube was the forerunner of the cathode ray tube that was used in television sets for decades. Physicist J.J. Thomson discovered that these beams were made up of tiny negatively charged particles, and because they were carriers of electricity, they became known as electrons.